I think that the role that religion has come to play in terms of insurgencies around the world, I think to get a perspective on it, it's important to keep in mind what happened in Afghanistan and then post-Afghanistan. With Afghanistan, you really have the globalization of the jihad. That is, that many of the struggles that existed, whether they were resistance or terror, if you look at the Islamic movements and how they developed historically, modern Islamic movements, 70s, 80s, into the 90s, they were the Tunisian movement, the Algerian movement. That's the way they were identified. The Egyptian movements, okay? Afghanistan and post-Afghanistan is when, the jihad goes global. That is when you begin to see movements that can be both national and transnational, or movements that, like Al-Qaeda, will be primarily transnational. But as you try to kind of contextualize it, what's important to realize in terms of the fallout post-Afghanistan is that virtually every Muslim struggle, whether secular or religious, whether by people who are observant or not, has been cast in religious language. They're all cast as a jihad. People who die are shaheeds or martyrs. Think about whether you go from Bosnia to Al-Qaeda, but more importantly, think about Yasser Arafat when he was surrounded in Ramallah. One of the few scenes we saw on TV that really showed you what was happening, you had Arafat shouting into his cell phone, Shaheed, 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 not Palestine, Palestine, Palestine. It was martyrdom, 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 you see. And when the Palestinians began their own militia, now you had Hamas, which was the religious group. What do they pick but Al-Aqsa Brigade? Again, using religious symbols. And when people die, they don't just say they're patriots or that they died for Palestine. They are shaheeds or they are martyrs. So the power of religion is very much there as a mobilizer and legitimator, but I think that one wants to realize that it's the political side that becomes the most important. I'll come back to this in a second. I don't even know if I'll have time, but if you look, for example, at Iraq today, I mean, Sunni and Shia are identifiers, but who these Sunni and Shia are, you wouldn't want to think that they're all necessarily religiously oriented folks. That's their identification in their society. In the early 70s, I lived in Lebanon. Mike Hudson would know more about Lebanon than I would. He's older than I am. No, he's not. When you get to my age, you start making comments like that. I went to the eye doctor yesterday, and this woman said to me, "Are you still working?" And I thought, then my wife said, no, she means, are you still working at Georgetown? But I was incensed. I thought, she thinks I'm retired? I mean, what is this? But in any case, when I went to Lebanon, I remember, there was a guy next door that ran a place, and I used to kid him and say, I live across from the Maronite church. You never go there. How come you identify yourself as a Maronite? And as he put it, this is my primal identity, and if a civil war comes, I've got to have a community. It's the community I belong to. So when we look at Sunni and Shia fighting, in Iraq, it's not that religion can't play a role. It's not that religious leaders like Sistani and al-Hakim can't play a role or Muqtada Sadr. But a lot of people who are in these militias are concerned about their turf, about their future. And that's a primary driver. It's not necessarily about, the mosque. Okay. I think it's important to realize in terms of how things are playing out and the attractiveness of insurgency in some places, that a truism that you've heard is really still very significant, and that is that what we call a war against global terrorism, many in the Muslim world view as a war against Islam, okay? And just last night, I had a prominent Canadian journalist, who is Muslim in background, the way in which I am Italian-American in background, but he noted, having traveled around the world and recently written a book, he said, from a Muslim perspective, they see roughly 3,000 people dying in 9/11, several thousand people dying, American soldiers in Iraq, some Americans and Westerners dying in Afghanistan, but they see 500,000 dying as a result of the Iraqi sanctions. They see 50 to 600,000, depending on whether you go with the Johns Hopkins estimate about the number of people who die in Iraq. They see 200,000 dying in Chechnya, and so their answer is, who's under siege? And I think within that frame, I think that's a real issue. In the Gallup poll, we also discovered that broad majorities of Muslims across the world, moderate as well as extremist, if you ask them, what do you resent about the West? It is that they see Islam being denigrated, Islam being equated with terrorism, not just Muslim extremism being denounced, and then they see the ramifications of that. They see the ramifications. So, for example, again, those who are more radically minded see the ramifications in terms of this becoming, as an Arab friend of mine said on September 12th, 2001, we worry whether this will be simply you're going after bin Laden, or this will become an excuse for redrawing the map of the Middle East. And I think that's part of the challenge that we face. For many in the Muslim world, they look at a trajectory post 9/11, and then it plays out within countries, which looks like you didn't just go into Afghanistan, you then broadened and talked about second frontiers, axis of evil. You then went into Iraq. You didn't have the right reasons. You went in for the wrong reasons. In the early days in Iraq, not only did you screw up, but look, you talked about democracy and self-determination, but in fact, it looked like the only kind of democracy you wanted was an American brand of democracy. So those are the kinds of, some of the issues that wind up playing out. I'll bring this to a quick, but I just want to cover a few things. What is the, because I had a couple of questions that were suggested here. All right, skip that one. Why is the idiom of religion so often chosen? Again, this is a no-brainer. You look at most studies, in the last 20 or 30 years, liberal nationalism, various forms of secularism are seen as failing because governments have failed that have relied upon them. Religion is a broad-based kind of a source of identity, sense of history, sense of values. It means many things to many people. Think of the Iranian Revolution. People went out in the street against the Shah and wanted to see, quote, some kind of new government. Not everybody who went out against the Shah and identified with religious symbols was looking for a religious government. The Gallup poll shows, for example, that most Muslims in the world don't want a theocracy, which is also interesting in terms of this. Now, can these struggles be fairly called Islamist insurgencies? Islamism is a broad term for political Islam. In that sense, you can say yes, but it covers diverse phenomena and diverse groups. So if the drivers are primarily political, economic, and cultural grievances, issues like occupation, fear of domination and dependency, or exploitation of resources, and belief that the U.S. will not support self-determination. What that means then is a variety of groups can plug in. So if you just use the word Islamist, you've got to distinguish between groups like the Muslim Brotherhood or between a leader like, and we've learned this, like Sistani, and let's say Muqtada as-Sadr and his militia, or other groups. And then in between, we've got to learn how to deal with groups like Hamas and Hezbollah. This is a new ballgame in terms of these movements because you can't simply slant them as terrorist groups. They also participate within the system, and one of the things we've seen is if we don't know how to handle it or we send the wrong signals, not only does it play out bad on the ground within those countries, but it plays out bad in terms of our image globally and where we're really coming from on issues not only like Islam, but on issues like democratization or democracy. How legitimate are regional states which the insurgencies battle? That's easy. Most of them aren't. At least in the eyes of many. I mean, the issue of legitimacy, and we know it from the level at which these governments rely on security for their stability. Governments like Egypt, governments like Jordan, of course we've seen it in Iraq, a number of the Gulf states. These are very, very fragile relationships in terms of their legitimacy, not only because of the rulers, but also because of some of the divisions in the Gulf states, for example, between religious groups. I mean, look at Bahrain. You have a Sunni minority ruling a Shia majority. And how the issue works out will be, it seems to me, a real issue.